Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. So today we're going to talk about something that's less philosophical and more of a current event. Although I do think it's a little bit of an understatement to act like it's just a current event because a lot of things about social media and censorship are perennial. They're always on, at least the outskirts of the discourse. It's something that everybody's always talking about for whatever reason. It comes up every couple months in the form of a different scandal or a different event. But it's been in the news a lot this year, especially since January. So I guess we're just going to have a freewheeling conversation about social media, censorship, freedom of speech, and all those types of issues. And one of the reasons that I kind of wanted to have this conversation is because although me and Matt um, see eye to eye on a lot of these issues. I think we still have some, I guess, minor disagreements to some extent. And I think this is a uniquely sticky situation that, and I think a lot of analysis on it is it's incomplete. Is the way I'd put it, especially me as a person who's an ANCAP that listens to a lot of libertarian commentary. There are some people who I think are just truly I think they truly miss the point or have an incomplete view of what's happening and are they lack nuance. So I just want to have a conversation about it. I don't think we're going to come away with this with, oh, here's how things should proceed going forward, or I don't think we'll necessarily have a certain outlook, but I think it's just something that we could spend an hour talking about it, considering we spend more than an hour talking about much more esoteric things. Um, okay, so I think maybe a good jumping off point would just be to set the scene a little bit for people who haven't been following the current news and things that have just gone on in 2021. So everybody should is probably aware of the insurrection on Capitol Hill on January 6th, and that subsequently led to Twitter banning Donald Trump from Twitter. That's kind of the big news on that front. A lot of people since then have gotten banned from Twitter. A lot of people migrated to Parler, which is another social media website that tends to cater more towards right wing people. So more alternatives that you might have heard of are Gab, Minds, and Parler, and those are all typically seen as more right wing because they're allegedly more lax about what people say on those platforms. Parler lost their cloud server that allowed the website to run on system. They were hosted by Amazon Web Services, and they pulled Parler servers. And then just in the last, I think, 3 days, Parler got back online. So Parler was down for about a month there. So a lot of these things have come up that have had certain people in the somewhat mainstream political spectrum getting banned. A lot of them are seen as more radicals, I guess, like the My Pillow guy. I think he got banned from Twitter, and he's seen as like a kook. But a lot of people have been getting banned from the more, I guess, regular social media sites. And then we saw one of the more alternative social media sites get the rug pulled out from it. So I think that's a lot of the lens that I'm viewing the recent events through now. Is that an okay, I guess, jumping off point? Okay. Um, did you want to add anything to that before we get into, I guess, what we think about it?
Yeah, well, I think I just wanted to add a quick, I guess, kind of historical point. And I wanted to compare, so like, sort of a certain, what is perceived to be the American kind of view on speech and the law, and then certain European views on speech and law. I think in Europe, people are far more willing to say, uh, in theory, that certain speech is not allowed. Like in Britain, I think libel laws are much more strict. And there just seems to be a bit more of a willingness to use government, the levers of power to prevent people from mentioning certain topics or bringing up certain opinions. But the U.S. is just kind of weird in that we have in the Bill of Rights the freedom of speech amendment. Now, of course, it hasn't always been followed exactly, and obviously that there. Um, that's not to say that we're perfect, but I think a lot of the issues about like free speech and PC culture and social media banning certain people and not banning other people, I think a lot of it does boil down to the interesting or the unique way that the, the unique attitude almost of that Americans have on freedom of speech. Um, I mean, I guess at some level you could say censorship and political correctness and whatnot is a global issue, but I feel like it's especially contentious in the U.S. given kind of the way the U.S. works and given certain kind of presuppositions built into U.S. culture related to these topics. So I just wanted to add that point before we give our takes on the issue itself.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that brings up in an indirect way an important way of contextualizing, I guess, thinking about these issues. And I think part of why a lot of low IQ discourse goes so wrong is they conflate things that are semi-related but aren't completely related, and then they get to misguided conclusions, which is like half of why I like hate NPR so much. So one thing you brought up that I think should go to the framing of the issue is there's clearly, and it is, I'm not stating something that's profound here. I'm just saying it so we can be cognizant of it. There are two segments. There's thinking about things legally, and there's thinking about the culture and the ethos of it. And that's probably why I think this is a more important issue than you might, is because I think I might have a slightly different view on maybe part of the how I view the cultural side of it. But I also think there are parts to the legal end of it that should be viewed in a different way than they're pervade in the mainstream discourse. So I think that is relevant. And yeah, I mean, I have obviously agree the United States is unique about certain types of regulations. I think a lot of what I've learned in the last few years, paying more attention to some global news, because you get a lot more of that if you listen to business news. And I've been listening to a lot more business news over like the last 4 or 5 years. And just by hearing the kinds of things they regulate differently than the United States, you know that they take a much stricter stance on all these things. And even in the United States, like I'm not sure if you're aware, but certain political figures are trying to be they currently have suits filed against them by certain voting systems, right? So like well, what's the company? God, it's Dominion Voting Systems is suing like a bunch of people for libel. And in the United States, I hear about these lawsuits and I think they're funny, because I can't imagine a world where Dominion can actually meet our strict standards of libel, because they have to show that the person who's spreading the quote unquote misinformation is doing it knowing that it's wrong, right? So we have all these strict protections, even about things like civil suits and libel, that it's and that's why so many of them end up settling in court, is because it's so hard to actually prove it in a court of law. So there are some important distinctions there. Okay, so I'm going to start heading a little bit into why I see certain things are concerning. So there's kind of two ways that I guess we could start that I think you might find a little interesting. But I'm going to go with the more, I guess, generic one that I hear about. So the simplest objection from the libertarian end of things, there are two very common objections. One is if you're talking about social media censorship, the first thing you'll hear out of a libertarian is they're private companies, right? So private companies, if you're small government oriented, you don't want the government fiddling around in private industries. They should be allowed to do what they want. So I agree with that message in this situation, to the extent that I don't think the government could do things better than what those companies are doing. I think where the libertarians are deeply misguided is thinking of social media companies as private companies. And it's not because they're a utility or a public square or any of that garbage that Dave Rubin would say. It's because every few months, these companies are brought before Congress and they're screamed at for not meeting certain things that congressmen would find more appealing, right? So you bring Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress every 2 months, and then they yell Mark Zuckerberg in his face, and they say, hey, your platform's being used for all these things. You need to stop that. Then the Republicans pull them up and they say, hey, you're doing too much of this, too much of that. It's a problem. So every 2 months, you have all these people from Twitter and Facebook getting reamed, and they have regulations held over their head at every corner. Why would we expect these companies to act in a way that is free? And why don't we think of them as extensions of the legislators that are threatening them consistently? So I actually kind of am suggesting that the fact that we're assuming that they're acting as private companies instead of companies that are afraid of the government, therefore are doing government's bidding indirectly, is just a weird way of thinking about it. It's odd that we start from the point of they're private companies when they're acting in fear of the government, so they're doing things that the government potentially wants them to do. So when Facebook bans Infowars and Alex Jones after they just got reamed by the whoever the top Democrat is for having too much fake news, and they specifically will name drop Alex Jones, then it's like, okay, why are we saying, well, Facebook has the right, they're a private company, and not thinking about how they were just threatened to do into doing the things that they did? So what I'm saying, I'm not saying there's direct cause and effect. What I'm saying is there's this disgusting blurring of public and private that's happening, and it's making it a much more confounding scenario than the libertarians that are trying to simplify it to. And I find that deeply concerning because, as most leftists are have a problem with, is the private public partnerships, because that's the heart of cronyism, and that's the heart of a somewhat more traditional fascism that people on the left are afraid of. And that's what I'm seeing in an indirect way here. So I don't think the answer is to get more government involved, but I think by saying they're a private company, you have to respect that, is just missing something that seems so apparent. So I'll let you jump in, because I probably spent like 5 minutes trying to say that in a somewhat comprehensible way. But that's been my big sticking point. And I've had such an issue with people, I guess, in my indirect circles saying that. And I was probably saying that a year ago. And I think that's misguided.
So every now and then on this podcast, I think one of us just makes a point that the other never really thought about before. And this is one of those examples. So I'm going to be thinking off the top of my head. So if I make mistakes, or if I I might come to reject what I'm saying right now. But I think you are bringing up something very. I think you're bringing up an important point, and that is the power that is behind social media, and the government that is behind aspects of that power. Now, the interesting thing, I guess, when it comes to the limitations on speech, I mean, it depends. So I guess, and you're not exactly saying this, but some libertarian who's making a simplistic argument might, only focus on the way that government can inhibit speech. But I think there are ways that business can inhibit speech. So that there are these two forces in our lives, which directly or indirectly cause us to not say certain things, or we're not allowed to say certain things, or we get in trouble. So an example that comes to mind is there was some controversy a while back with some British airway, and then the and this airline had passed some like they changed some rule, like you can't have the stewardesses can't wear jewelry. But then a lot of the stewardesses were wearing crosses. And so there was a big hullabaloo, because it was a question of like, well, do we protect people's freedom of religion by allowing them to wear crosses, or do we force them to not wear their crosses because this is company policy and you're fired? And then this is an absurd example. But if you're working for, Coca-Cola, and you go into work wearing a bunch of Pepsi merchandise, and you're, loudly proclaiming what a great drink Pepsi is and how much you hate Coca-Cola, you're probably going to get a call from the boss being like, I don't think you can do that, or you're out. So now some of this, of course, some of it comes down to personal choice, and or in terms of at least the jobs you're using, or the jobs you're using, it's the job you agree to take on, and the what you are willing to say or do at work. You know, a libertarian might say some of it comes down to personal choice. But if we're talking about like what we're allowed to say and what we're not allowed to say, we have to think about all the forces that are controlling or can control what we do and do not say. Like, I mean, YouTube, this podcast gets uploaded to YouTube, and I mean, we're not like very well known, so we haven't like had any problems yet. But I mean, at some level, we have to, as content creators, we have to think about, well, okay, should I say this on that this is going to go up to YouTube? Should I say this? Should I not say this? Is this going to get a strike on the video or the channel or whatnot? There's just so many kind of factors and forces that are that go behind that are like working behind the scenes that we don't think about when we kind of ask questions of like, you know, what are the limits of freedom of speech, or should there be limits? Are you allowed to say anything you want? So yeah, that's kind of my response to what you said.
Yeah. So a lot of that, like, so so an example of like the kind of speech that a libertarian would be okay with having censored is you buy a ticket to the ballet, and then the ballet starts and everybody's silent, and then one guy starts screaming, and then the ushers go and they escort him out because you can't scream during a ballet, and everybody's cool with that. And the reason why is because it's like, okay, it makes sense that that's the ballet's rules. Everybody agrees on those ballet's rules. It's the same reason why you don't walk into like, I guess, like a kid's ballet studio and start saying vulgar things to people. It's the same kind of thing, and this goes to, I guess, like all the private property that, like, the things that Hans Hermann Hoppe would talk about in libertarian circles. So all that stuff they're on board with. I think the issue happens is when they try to apply that same thing to social media websites, as if those social media websites aren't bludgeoned by potential government regulations and then constant hearings, right? So that's where I think it gets sticky, and that's where I think the oversimplification happens. But yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of different scenarios that can be evaluated, and then there are all kinds of times where, I mean, I'm sure everybody who's gone to public school in the last 20 years has had issues with like dress codes and stuff like that, and certain things being banned for seemingly arbitrary reasons. So there are different ones you can evaluate and think of the validity. But I guess I was just trying to make the point. Social media seems uniquely sticky of an area because of those types of badgering that goes on. And we know that they're mostly unregulated, at least in certain aspects. And you know that every time regulations happen, there's huge compliance burdens. So it can directly impact their finances. And then it's like, okay, now it reeks of cronyism. And it's because of government. And this is one of the main ways, unfortunately, like for better or worse, but it's one of the main ways people talk about issues. So, and it clearly has government fingerprints on it. So that's why that part specifically kind of spooks me. But not a lot of people are framing it in that way. Like, I actually was pleasantly surprised that literally on Monday I was listening to Reason Magazine's Roundtable podcast, and they actually were asked a question that was pretty similar to this. But I haven't been hearing a lot of discourse about it, thinking about it this way. But yeah, I think we're on the same page, at least to some degree, thinking about how it's different than, say, like a ballet studio. Yeah. Okay. There were a couple other things I want to get into that are more on the ethos of free speech and why I think they should be concerning for people who are kind of consider themselves on the left, or at least anybody who's radical in any degree. Should kind of be concerned about it. So I think I'll start off by saying something that I think you thought of. It's like the thought that comes to your mind when I said I want to do an episode on free speech and censorship. And it's, why would we do this? The internet has so many alternative ways of getting information out. Nobody can really have their voice kind of fully stamped out, right? So if Ben Shapiro got taken off YouTube, it's like, okay, well, he still has a huge platform that pays to see him. If somebody gets kicked off YouTube, they could still go to BitChute. They could still post their podcast on a ton of feeds. There are all these alternative ways to get information now that are beyond, I guess, just basically saying Facebook and Twitter, right? And I think that's like an important thing to recognize. The issue is, I like thinking about things from certain. I guess everybody who's like mildly academic has certain research that they apply to a lot of things. And one thing that I'm very familiar with is behavioral economics and the works of like Daniel Kahneman, Dan Ariely, and I apologize for my cat meowing in the background. I can't do anything about it. So there's these behavioral economists have shown that a lot of times if something's not super important to somebody, they stick with the default, right? God. So people stick with the default on issues, right? So your cable your cable package, the default package is something, okay, that's fine, whatever. Unless I'm specifically concerned with certain things, I'm not going to care. Well, when people default to big social media websites, because there are these network effects. So if all your family's on Facebook and you use Facebook for your family, you default to Facebook. Well, now these things you default to are being indirectly regulated by the government, which is essentially the neoliberal establishment. So that means anything that is radical and outside of the purview of the neoliberal establishment can never break into the hive mind that is the default. Like it can still live on BitChute. It can still live on the peripheries. And once it gets too big and then catches attention on YouTube, it might get stamped off YouTube and onto something else. It can live on the peripheries, so your voice will always have a place. But if the neoliberal establishment is indirectly censoring the default platforms for the majority, then you can't break into the majority. You can always have your niche, but it's hard to break into there. And that's a way they can protect their like hegemony, right? That's the way they can dominate they can continue to dominate the discourse. And I think that's something that's worth being concerned about, I guess, if you think about it in that way. That was just something I kind of put together when I was thinking about it. So yeah, when you hear that, what are your thoughts? And maybe you can incorporate some stuff into my thinking about it.
So right off the bat, I have two thoughts. One, I really just get the sense that when it comes to censorship and social media, it's really a back and forth. I don't really see a tide of like just overwhelming censorship. I see a tide of, okay, this particular social media platform does a little bit of censorship. There's a little pushback. They rework their terms of service, and it's just a constant back and forth between what the companies can get away with and what the governments want the companies to do on the one side, and on the other side, what people want out of social media and what they want to be able to do with various platforms. So I guess I'm not so sure that there really is this tendency of overwhelming censorship. And the other thing that I was thinking about, so many of these people especially like certain members of the intellectual dark web and just various anti-establishment, or a lot of people in the culture war, they kind of frame the issue as I'm being censored, I'm being attacked, the government hates me, the media hates me, but I'm going to triumph because, or I'm going to fight them and still get my message out there. But I don't really see these people suffering the same, like I don't see these people really suffering censorship in any way that is really destroying their career. Ben Shapiro's career is fine. Jordan Peterson's career is fine. Brett Weinstein's career is fine. I mean, you can cite a few people. You can cite Alex Jones has been thrown under the bus. Milo Yiannopoulos has been thrown under the bus. A few people's careers have been adversely affected, correct. But a lot of these people, I don't think their career has been affected really in the slightest. In fact, it's probably helped their career when they're able to cite actual or imagined instances of censorship.
Well, I don't think a lot of those figures that we think of in like the intellectual dark web, the people that spend as much time talking about how important it is to have tough conversations as they actually are having real conversations. I agree with that criticism of them, but I think the issue there is they aren't that radical. That's why they haven't actually been canceled in any way that's tangible. Dave Rubin is just at this point like a moderate conservative, who he doesn't have anything that substantive or radical to say. Now, a lot of them are doomsaying and about how they could fall into that victim class, and I'm sympathetic to the argument that they aren't really at risk, but if you hang out more on the peripheries of radical thought, there have been people who've had like their small platforms kind of taken away from them for whatever reason. So I know oh my god, why am I so bad with these people's names? Jimmy Dore, that's who it is. See, this is me. I'm doing my best to expand into like some radical left people in my mind, since I came from the right. So I listen to all the moderate right wing people, but I never take the time to actually learn the names of the people on the left I listen to. But I know Jimmy Dore interviewed a guy who was like a radical left member who had like a big Facebook group on the left, and Jimmy Dore brought up censorship to that guy, and that guy kind of shrugged it off. He's like, no, all the people who are getting off Facebook, like Donald Trump getting banned from Twitter is great. And his group got banned like within the next week after his Jimmy Dore interview. And it's because it's these people who are actually radical and actually are outside of the accepted, 3x5 card of allowable opinion. Those are the people who are actually at risk, and they all are small. So you don't really hear about it when those people get taken off Twitter. And then I've been a listener of Free Man Beyond the Wall with Pete Quinones for probably like a year and a half now. And he is edgy, I guess. So he's more likely to say things that are offensive to people. But he had probably 36,000 followers on Twitter, something in that ballpark range. And he got his account permabanned recently. So there have been people who I guess I would actually consider radical, who've had their platforms taken away. And then I just wanted to backtrack to one thing you said about the push and pull, I guess. But between Twitter like bans Alex Jones a couple of years back, whatever. People didn't like it, but they didn't really ban anybody for a while. Well, I was actually kind of on page with that. But I think it's a lot of what's been a reaction to the January 6th insurrection is what's really, I guess, put this more directly on my radar. And that's because Trump got, completely banned from Twitter, which even if it's like I never actually was a person who followed him, I just saw his tweets talked about in the news all the time. That seemed a little, that was a large step. And I don't know if you recall, but when Kamala Harris was actually running for president in the primaries, she was asking Twitter to ban Donald Trump, and it seemed ridiculous at the time. It's like, they're not going to ban Donald Trump. He's too much of a prominent figure. And then while he was still president, he got banned. And then really the whole thing where Amazon Web Services pulled Parler's hosting services right when they were getting their most traffic. And they got their most traffic because people were reacting to Trump getting banned. They were saying Twitter's banning Trump. I'm not going to use Twitter. I'm going to go on Parler. And then Amazon Web Services pulls up a bunch of tweets. I mean, not tweets, but parlays, I think is what they call them on Parler, that were offensive and they were inflammatory and they were violent. And they were at least, saying supporting violence, if not directly calling for it. But they said, hey, you posted this, so we're not giving you web service. And then boom, Parler's off the internet for a month. And there were tens of thousands of people who had their information on there. So that's the stuff that I think is like, I guess, more groundbreaking in the last month that is more concerning than, I guess, just Milo and Alex Jones. So that's why it's been more of a concern to me. Yeah.
I mean, I think censorship is an issue. I think that just the way I hear a lot of people conceptualize it, I just vehemently disagree with. I
agree with you there.
And we haven't really touched on this, but it might be a good place to mention it. I just hear the narrative being, oh, these radical leftists, these crazy social justice warriors, they're banning everything. We're gonna have a future where you can't say anything now because, and I'm slightly exaggerating to get a bit to get my point across, but I guess the kind of the contention I have, or what I want to try to take what I'm hoping someone who would listen to this would take away from this podcast is, I don't think it's a matter of like radical leftists ruining the world. The issues we're having with censorship, and there are some, or there are definitely issues with censorship going on. It is much more related to like cronyism and both malicious and malicious behavior from the government and from corporations. Because at some level, I mean, in your opening, you were kind of giving the impression of the government controlling the corporations, but I think it's much more of a 50-50 partnership in many ways, not completely, but in many ways. It's both the government and both corporations and businessmen, very like the top of the top when it comes to businessmen. They are kind of working together to kind of at some level bring about there's an Orwellian term that I'm forgetting now, but they're trying to come up with kind of just a cozy vocabulary that people can use in which to talk about the issues, and you can't talk about it outside that, or you're just crazy, or you won't get any views and whatnot. So I guess so if we disagree, it might be related to that, because I think we do agree on that we do agree that censorship is wrong, and we agree that censorship is a problem. But we might disagree on like kind of why it's happening. But even if we don't agree, or even if we agree on this, a lot of people don't. That's really kind of my main point that I want to make in this podcast.
Well, and that's part of it, right? So part of the censorship is, hey, look, if you don't ban this, we're going to put on regulations. And if you put on regulations, you don't make as much money, and you guys are here to make money. But part of it is some of the people at these companies do have an agenda, and then they are being censorious. Now, I think the economics of everything gets really confusing because it brings up how every industry has regulations, and then those regulations raise barrier to entry. And once you have barrier to entry that's high, it's hard for competitors to enter the market. So like an example of this is, I'm sure you're familiar with it. Well, I might be assuming that's more common knowledge than it is, but like in the last several years, Europe has expanded privacy rights and data rights for people on the internet. Well, here's the thing. When you use Facebook or Twitter, you don't pay a fee. They make money off you by selling your by targeting ads to you based off information they can figure out. Well, if a company can't monetize things with certain strategies, then they can't be a viable business. So it's harder to start from scratch if you don't have certain avenues to actually make money as a business. So there are things that are keeping competitors from opening. Now, with that said, network effects, it's an economics thing, I guess. A brief summary is Facebook, it's like having a phone. You only have value with your phone in terms of calling people because other people have phones. So Facebook kind of benefits from something similar. You benefit from Facebook because other people are on Facebook. You benefit from Twitter because other people are on Twitter. Nobody is on Twitter, it'd be useless. So it's hard to start from scratch also for that reason. I think that was the real problem with Parler. And that's why I thought it was such a groundbreaking thing when they got banned, is because enough people were jumping to it to where I actually thought they would be able to get past those network effect problems. So I guess what I'm saying is it's kind of the perfect storm of an issue. Where you have companies with agendas, you have governments with agendas, you have governments with regulatory burdens. You have to abide by foreign countries' regulations because the users that sign up might be on those, they might be from that country. So there are all these hoops that people are jumping through. And then unfortunately, we live in a world where that's the easiest way to get news for a lot of people. So now you have, okay, well, here's where people are forming their political opinions because less people have cable and more people go on Twitter. And it's like, well, what am I seeing? What am I being allowed to see? And who's deciding what I'm allowed to see? So I agree that a lot of the blame is on the companies. I'd probably put more of the blame on governments for all of the reasons I put blame on governments. But it is like this hellscape, I guess, of a situation. Now the ethos of free speech is what comes into the right and left wing dynamic. And I think that's where you hear people croning in with that narrative that it's left wing fascists trying to silence right wingers. And it's because a lot of I guess, I hate talking about it, but cancel culture, for whatever that is, whatever you take that as, generally is coming from what is at least seen as people who are activists on the left. So a lot of people who are directly trying to, in the last few years, you'll have people on Fox News who all of a sudden a ton of people are calling all their sponsors that have ads that play during that show. And then they're saying, hey, pull your sponsorship from Tucker Carlson because Tucker Carlson's a racist. So you have these people directly like trying to get people in trouble for saying what they're saying. And like, I'm not one to say that you shouldn't do that. You can hold advertisers accountable if you want to, but it's this ethos of, I don't like what this person has to say. I think they're vile, so I'm going to try to strip, their revenue sources from them. Is an anti, I guess, it's a somewhat censorious ethos, even if there's nothing legally wrong with it. And I would argue that if you actually believe that Tucker Carlson is a heinous person, you should try to deprive him of money if he's hurting you with the ideas he purveys. Because I wouldn't be against people doing that for anybody who has statist messaging. If anybody's supporting what I see as the largest domestic terrorist organization, I'm okay with you getting, if you call people to get rid of their avenues of funds, I guess I don't see the big problem with that. So there is this ethos of censoring people you don't like because you can see how their ideas end up harming you if they're actually taken into account by people in power. So that's another tricky situation because there's clearly like no law that entitles somebody to advertiser money, but it's also something that is seen by a lot of people in poor taste to do. And a lot of that activism that ends up coming up in very natural ways comes from the I would say it's from the left, because the left has a lot of organizations that do this kind of work. So you have this narrative that has hints of truth, because every narrative I think has at least some truth in it, that the left is censoring people. And it's like, well, yeah, some people on the left go out of their way to get people censored and some people don't. And then there are some right-wing people who I guess are like right-wing snowflakes. And then they think everything that's anti-Israel should get banned and deplatformed. So it is a lot of push and pull, and there is not a strong ethos, I guess, of free from consequences speech in the dialogue of ideas. I think when you talk about working like at Pepsi or Coke and then wearing their gear, that's a different kind of question of ethos of free speech, because those things are kind of different. But I guess when we talk about the public square ethos of free speech, it's not free from consequence speech. And I think that should be taken for granted. And I think the narratives have truth in them, but I don't agree with the narratives either. I wouldn't say Dave Rubin's right when he talks about freedom of speech and how the left wants to destroy it. But I'm sure you have much more critical thoughts on this part, because I think this is where a lot of your antipathy comes from.
I guess my antipathy, well, before I say that, I just want to point out, I'm glad we don't make any money from this podcast, because given what you said about not supporting people who support domestic terrorism, i.e. government, in any way, I get my money taken away if we ever make money from this podcast. I just wanted to point that out. So I guess my hesitancy to kind of talk about this issue stems from, I guess, and this is kind of the issue I guess we always kind of run into with these conversations. It's just, how are people defining words? Because we can say, and again, you're making a distinction here, so I appreciate that. But someone could say the left hates free speech, and then I just have to spend 20 minutes unpacking, well, what do you mean by the left? And what tends to happen is, or I hear a lot of people talking about, again, radical leftists. So they think these people, maybe read one book by Marx in college. So they like, oh, I'm a Marxist. Or, I mean, some people call themselves Marxists. They don't even know what the heck they're talking about. But that's beside the point. people are looking at the issue through the lens of, well, we have to stop these people because like the Soviet Union banned people they didn't like from speaking. The Mao's China did it. Castro's Cuba did it. Well, Cuba still has issues with free speech post Castro. So they're looking at it as, oh no, there could be a far left takeover of everything that's going to a far left takeover of government and the media and all of these just a far left takeover of pretty much all of society. That's in some ways how I see it framed. Again, I probably watch too much BoomerCon content. That might be part of my issue, but and I hear some people my own age have similar they talk about it in similar ways. But like what people don't seem to bring up is how it's the neoliberals that are the most pernicious about this. It is the it is the mainstream left that is so adamant about like banning Donald Trump from Twitter because he says naughty words. So I just think that that's an important point to keep in mind when we're talking about this. It is that there is a faction on the left which you could say is in large part responsible for this, but it is not the faction of the left that most people think about when they talk about this. And we've talked about the kind of that issue before, but there really is no radical left agenda or like movement in the United States right now. People don't really people don't go join communist or Trotskyist or Marxist parties in the United States. It really is a function of the government and corporations coming together under this ideology of neoliberalism, and then trying to appeal to popular activism and trying to appeal to like a lot of people's frustration with the system by saying, oh well, the I don't know what the company that produces Oreos, but we're LGBT friendly. Like, okay, that's good. We shut up now. Don't worry about what's happening to the world. Don't think, because the people who own Oreo or make Oreos are okay with the LGBT community. That's great. So it is a way to kind of sidestep actual like change in the system, even actual leftist change in the system, because it's just appealing to emotion. It's appealing. It makes them it using appealing to these ideas. It just makes them look good. It's publicity, it allows them a certain cover for what they're actually doing. And this is almost kind of where I start to sound like the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek. But a lot of this censorship and PC culture and culture war stuff, and a lot of it just boils down to the government and corporations are trying to save face. They want to keep the system the way it is indefinitely. And so they appeal to these sentiments in order to not have to do anything, and in order to prevent other people from doing anything. So actually, at the end of the day, you can make the argument that our current form of capitalism is in large part responsible for the issues of censorship and social media and PC culture and all of that.
Yeah, I would say the profiteering, like with certain types of branding, is a bit of a different category. But I found it interesting and funny. None, even though I think it's completely, I guess, separate territory. And I think it is worth unpacking. And I have no problem laying the blame at state capitalism. I'm totally cool with that. But a lot of it comes down to I wish I knew I wish I knew the study offhand. But Boomer Khan in chief that I always reference, Ben Shapiro, has been talking about it all week, and it's a study that pretty much surveyed people about their approval for a generic company, like company XYZ, and then if they knew that company XYZ was liberal, how much would they approve of it? And it was about the same. And if they were conservative, how much would they approve of it? And then it was significantly less. And it's just because currently people assume every company, if they don't know different, is a liberal company. It's not that people view liberal companies more or less favorably. It's if you just say, do you favor this company? Everybody assumes in the United States 2021 that it's just a liberal organization, because, and I mean that in the neoliberal, in a way that's virtue signaling. And it's like, I mentioned to you that I guess maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyways. I work for a multinational company, and I do all the generic diversity training stuff, and it's all the same. It's all the same garbage. It's all posturing, and it's not very full of substance. And that's why you'll hear people who are like hardcore identitarian end up, they are also, they also spend a lot of time, they aren't a fan of Oreo's branding LGBT because they understand what it is. They understand that corporations are co-opting their messaging because their messaging is at least popular to a niche. And then they're like, hey, we can make more money if we do this. So of course those companies do it. I don't blame those companies for doing it. It's just kind of fascinating. And it's funny that if you're kind of in the know that they don't really care, that they're doing it because they make more money, then you can laugh at it, right?
It's like,
yeah,
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. It's just another an easy example, which is not even related to social media at all, is how people are making jokes on the internet that we're diversifying the war machine. So the people that are responsible for a lot of this neo-conservative interventionist foreign policy in the United States, like now the Biden administration was trying to get people on that weren't old white men, and it's their way of like, well, look, we got some we got women or minorities on the team now, we're good. So that was just an example.
Well, and
another thing that like is illustrative of my point, just isn't related to social media or free speech.
Well, and that also goes back to how Biden had to get the black guy to be their Secretary of Defense. I think he's the former Raytheon executive, and it's like, well, don't look at that. He worked for Raytheon in the military-industrial complex. You should notice that he's black, and there has been a black person in this position before. And then everybody can clap, and then they went on Twitter and they saw that headline and it said, oh, for first black person doing X, Y, and Z, good job, Joe Biden. And then you pat him on the head. So it's a lot of that type of pandering is very silly, but I think we're on the same page of that not being substance. And I think what this ends up coming back to, and it's a topic that we end up covering directly or indirectly a lot of times, but it's about how stories are framed. And like, even though we come down a little bit different on maybe who the biggest instigators are of the social media problem, we both come down on the side of the current narratives that are perpetuated aren't particularly truthful, or at best are incomplete, or unnuanced. So it's stuff like that. Like there are so many examples of like the stimulus package, the 1.9 trillion stimulus. Like you can tie so much of it to coronavirus related things, but the majority of it isn't. A lot of the school funding in it is tied up over the next 10 years, not over the next year. So it's like, but the headline will be, X amount of money so schools can reopen with better, coronavirus procedures in place. And it's like, well, yeah, but there's 10 times the funding for years 3 through 10 from now. So it's like, is that really the case? It's like, no, it's a misleading headline. In the same way that, hey, look, we diversified the war machine it's a distraction. It's look over here. We're going to do something that's not important, but you can look at the thing that makes you feel good instead of talking about an issue. And this is why, that for a little bit there, I was reading Jacobin and subscribed to Jacobin, and they have an academic journal called Catalyst, and they critiqued all the hashtag activism, all that stuff that got going in like the last 5-6 years is, it's verbiage without action. It's a huge problem. But I would say the same problem is with the intellectual dark web, right? Because they spend all this time talking about how people are censored and how you have to have tough conversations. But 90% of their tough conversations are talking about how important it is to have tough conversations. So it's like, well, what value are you contributing other than we should be allowed to talk? So hopefully, I think to this point, we've gone a bit beyond that in this episode. not to make a pun on her name. Okay, I like how we got off topic there, and it was good off topic, so I appreciate that. That was nice. Do you have anything you want to add before we wrap this one up? Because I think we got a lot of stuff in this episode, even though it's a little shorter than our last few.
I guess I'll just wrap up by saying, so I guess the other reason why I was a little uncertain about talking about this topic is just because of how terribly people, or how awful the conversations on this issue of censorship and free speech and social media and cancel culture and all that, it all goes down to, or it people do not really think about, or they're unwilling to like look at what's really going on in the situation. It just becomes a matter of like you said about framing. So that's why I almost never talk about like I mean I don't I almost never talk about like PC culture and culture war stuff, because it's just the people I see talking about it, they have agendas. They're not talking about it properly, and it's all a waste of my time. It's all a waste of everyone else's time. Now, I guess so I had an interesting experience, of course, in terms of like internet culture, and I bring this up because I think it's good for a little context. So when I was like a teenager, I was a little edgy, not gonna lie, as a lot of young teenage guys are, and so it's like I absorbed, or I watched quite a bit of like anti-social justice warrior content, and I kind of had this like the boomer con type talking points and attitude about it, and like really like, oh no, this is a serious issue going on, or well, I mean, it went even deeper than that. It's like a and then time went on, and I just realized, well, one, like we're saying, it's not framed properly, but two, I just think the way people talk about it, it makes it seem like, not necessarily that it's more of an issue than it should be, but they're pointing at something that really isn't an issue, and they're ignoring the actual issue. And that's kind of what I realized with a lot of these like anti-social justice warrior like YouTubers and whatnot. And so I stopped listening to them because I realized, I didn't think, I think they were blowing certain things out of proportion that they shouldn't, and they were ignoring or minimizing other aspects of the situation. So that really, at the end of the day, is kind of boils down kind of why I've come to the conclusion that I've come to. We agree generally on this issue. I just think a lot of people talk about things that don't need to be. They make issues out of things that aren't actually issues, when it comes to talking about censorship. So that's kind of my that kind of dovetails to my earlier point about, it's kind of a waste of time to talk about this, or it's not as big of a deal as people make it out to be. I just think, I think censorship is a big deal. I just think it's not a big. The way people frame it makes it seem like the issues are what they're not. So I hope I didn't repeat myself too much, but
yeah, I think where we end up disagreeing is it's just I think we disagree on maybe the scope of the issue, because I still think I think it's a big problem, but I think a lot of the places where the concern is placed, like they'll blame the radical left, and it's like, well, the radical left is also getting banned from Twitter, so it's like, okay, so I agree that a lot of the narratives are wrong, but I'm also like genuinely, concerned, because it's the neoliberal order who runs Facebook, and it's the people who run the government. They're both establishment figures, and I've only seen it proliferate. It hasn't really gone in the opposite direction, and it's proliferated a lot in the last 2 months. Now, if it settles down like the next 6 months, then I might feel really silly for being concerned. But right now, especially with a lot of things tamping down on certain types of opinions related to the coronavirus, um, I do see it concerning. Now, I agree that it's not always worth talking about because what I don't have a great call to action, right? So if we talk about education, we talk about college, we talk about student loans, I can tell you the policies that I think are causing the problem, and I can tell you why. And then if somebody followed up with what I said and they looked into it and they ended up agreeing with me, then it's like, cool, now we have another person on team against X, Y, and Z policies. But on this issue, it's like, okay, well, I've identified that the boomer con rights have misallocated the problem to the wrong enemy. Okay, so that's step one. I've identified that it's a much more messy contingent of government corporate overlap than I anticipated. Okay, that's step two. I've recognized that there are barriers to entry for competitors because it's already hard to infiltrate the industry because of network effects. Okay, and then like a rising up and coming company got their web hosting taken away by Amazon Web Services. It's like, okay, all these things spell bad for me. Like all these things give me a concerning outlook that I think is beyond your concerning outlook. I feel like I'm leaving this as a kind of an incomplete episode because I don't have a takeaway for a random person. It's like hope that there are more alternatives, stick with your niches, and hope that something happens. But it's almost like hard for me to give hope here because it seems like the systems that they built are reinforcing, and they're against anybody who is radical, whether it's an actual radical left person or a radical right person. And I did do the aside in the middle of the episode about how there are hope. Like it's hard to stamp out people if they're on BitChute. It's hard to stamp out people in these corners of the internet that are escape really all things that can be banned. But it's like, okay, but then you can't reach the critical mass to actually, infiltrate the neoliberal establishment. So I see it concerning, and I think it's worth recognizing why it's concerning beyond the bad narratives. But I don't think I have a good call to action, which is unsatisfying. I was hoping I'd come up with something better by the time we recorded.
There's just kind of one more broad point I want to make, then we can wrap up the episode. So this is actually a good place to end up and to end the conversation, because it does, I think, boil down to not only something we disagree on, but also maybe our outlooks about kind of the future and how all this stuff is playing out. Because I really see. Okay, so to tie this back to the very first episode we did, when we covered the debate between Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Žižek, Žižek made an interesting point, and I think it was in that debate. Maybe it was in another lecture. I'm almost certain it was in that debate, though. He was making the point that the left wing activists. So we're not quite talking about government and business. We're kind of talking about like left wing activists. Which influence the way government and business behave. But Zizek was kind of saying, like, this is political correctness is the left's admission to defeat. It's like the last thing they can do before their whole ideology gets thrown in the gutter. It's a sign of weakness. It's a sign of impotence. It's not really doing anything, and it's not really going to do anything. It's just the last, like, this is a bad metaphor, but it's like when two people are in a fight to the death, it's like the person on the losing end, it's like their last chance to try to survive this battle before the other person finally gets to them. And that's really how I see a lot of this nonsense that comes from the left in terms of like cultural ideas. I don't see it really as, I don't think it's going to be incredibly influential in the long term. I don't really see too many changes to the way the way society works, except again in just minor changes in attitude or minor like adjustments to corporate policy or company policy, or like the training, diversity training you have to go through, like things like that, which are annoying, which are worthless, which don't affect any change. But I don't think, I'm not pessimistic because I don't think it's going to do anything. I don't even think it's going to do anything in terms of like, at some level, in terms of what the government and the business are doing. If it does anything, it will just if it does anything, it will just be used again, as I've been saying, as the mask to perpetuate this terrible socio-political and economic system that we have. But I'm not even sure that's going to work, because I think people see through it. I don't really. And again, I'm a college student, so I might have a bias here, or I might just have a particular perspective on this that I wouldn't if I were like an adult working in the workforce. But I just don't, in my interactions with people, I don't really see people tend to take this stuff seriously. I don't really see it affect people's opinions or really change the way they interact with the world or view the world. I really think it probably will pass, and then we'll kind of be looking back on it and kind of like, that was a weird cultural time. Then the okay, so just to kind of wrap up, the issues that we're facing, I think, are have more to do with things like economic policy, the way the government functions, things like that are really really the issues at stake here. And I don't know what's going to happen in that regard. In that regard, I might be more pessimistic. But I do not see that the censorship on social media, or the companies and government saving face by being PC. I don't see it being effective, and I don't see it really changing much in the long term. I'll give you the last word, and then we can close out the show.
The last thing that this reminds me of, and it's a quick anecdote, but it's more related to, I guess, political correctness. And I think political correctness is a separate conversation than a lot of what we talked about. A lot of what we talked about was censorship of, like, because Donald Trump has abhorrent opinions according to the mainstream. But political correctness is kind of like what words you're allowed to say. And political correctness scares me for the other reason. And I think it's because it's a battle over inches. And I think a lot of what people see in political correctness, it completely depends on the bubble of who they surround themselves with. And this is an anecdote, and I think it's funny and worth noting. And then I'll sign off. So story goes something like this: I'm 22 and at work in a desk job, and I'm talking to my coworker she's maybe 25. And this is important to recognize. She's only a few years older than me. And she's a completely normal person. I have no reason to suspect she's anything other than urban politically person. I guess I just would assume that she has the default setting views on everything. But she's a few years older than me, and I'm complaining to her about something that's stupid that we both work on. And she says, "I know, it's retarded." So I was surprised in a pleasant way, because I was raised in a school setting, high school setting, where pretty much where if you say the word retarded, it's worse than any swear word other than like racial epithets. And I was so surprised and like kind of like, oh, she said the word that you could say, 10 years ago when I was a kid, but before high school. But now that's not an allowable word. And I never hear anybody say it. And I think maybe 3 weeks before that, I was at a bar, and my roommate's girlfriend at the time got kind of upset with me for calling something retarded. So it's this parallel of, it doesn't really matter, but if enough people have the view of you can't say this word anymore, then you've lost the battle of inches, because now it's removed from your vernacular. Because if you don't know all the people in your setting, that word's off the table. And it's not that saying that word matters particularly much, but if you just want to say a generic word to complain about something, but a bunch of people have decided that it's extremely offensive, as opposed to 20 years ago when it wasn't very offensive. It was unpleasant, but it's like not, super offensive like it is now in a lot of groups. So that's where I see actual PC things. The battle is taking place in a matter of inches in random crowds. And if you're in your bubble with certain friends, the words you use don't change over a 5-year period, because you know the people. But when you go out in public or you meet new people, you're never going to use certain words around them. That's where I think PC has the most impact. But that's an anecdote, and that's a whole nother can of worms. I appreciate everybody who stuck out through this hour conversation on a lot of things that are you're seeing in culture wars. And I know we usually talk more, I guess, policy or philosophy or something like that. But I think this is worth addressing in a way that's better than how I hear it covered on NPR, because that is a uniquely frustrating experience. If anybody is frustrated by somebody in their life talking about politics, imagine that like times 10. And that's me when I listen to NPR on a daily basis. So I hope you guys got
And the
something
funny
out.
thing, oh,
Yeah,
sorry, I was just going to say the funny thing, commonality that me and my co-host have here, we both used to be the people that like listened to NPR and thought to ourselves, I'm becoming educated. And
yeah.
we
Oh my
both
God.
realized that was a very wrong indeed. That's just another funny little anecdote.
Yeah, I think one of the things about being a young adult is you have to hate who you were 2 years ago. And I guess at this point it was more like 4 years ago. But at one point I was a person who listened to NPR and thought I was getting good education. Now I listen to it so I can know what the mainstream narrative is and to know what a lot of people that think they're educated are hearing. And then I listen to something that dismantles everything that NPR says. And it's like, oh, okay, we've taken it a step deeper, and that's progress to some degree. So if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to check out the backlog of all our other dozens of episodes on other controversial topics or esoteric topics. And I guess you can tune in next week when we cover another thing that might be controversial. So we'll see you then. Signing off. It's Mad Matt.